Hey everyone, so today we're going to learn about the inferior view of the skull. So starting most anteriorly here we have the hard palate, and this hard palate is basically made up of two bones. Over here we can see the maxillary bones, and here we have the palatine bones posteriorly. Now the maxillary bones, we see that the two maxillary bones are joined together by this suture in the midlines known as the median palatine suture. This is a median palatine suture, and here we can see a horizontal suture which combines the palatine and the maxillary bones. This is known as the transverse palatine suture. Now these are basically these maxillary bones, we call them the palatine process of the maxillary bones, and these are the horizontal or the palatal process of the palatine bones. Now in the anterior midline we see a foramen over here. This is known as the incisive foramen. This incisive foramen is basically the passage for the nasopalatine nerves over here. So this is an important point over here. Next we can see the alveolar processes of this maxilla, and on the palatine bones we see two foramen over here. Now more laterally we see the greater palatine foramen, and posterior to it we see the lesser palatine foramen. So this was all about the most anterior view of the inferior view of the skull, like most anterior part of the anterior view of the skull. Here we saw about what's the hard palate, and we saw about the maxilla and the palatine bones. We studied about the sutures over here, the incisive foramen, the alveolar processes, and the greater and lesser palatine foramen. So this was a whole review about the anterior part. Now next, moving more posteriorly, let me raise. So now more posteriorly, or you can say the middle part, like if this, we say this one is the anterior part, and then this one is the middle part, and here we see the posterior part, most posterior. So first of all we covered the anterior part. Now moving on to the more middle part. So in the middle part we see here there are these two coni, nasal coni, and in between there is this vomer bone. These are separated by this vomer bone, and more laterally on the both sides of the coni there are the pterygoid plates of the sphenoid bone. Here you can see this medial pterygoid plate, and this more laterally there is the lateral pterygoid plate. Here you can easily identify this greater wing of the sphenoid, and lateral, like on the lateral aspect, posterior to the lateral aspect of the lateral pterygoid plate, you can see a foramen that's known as the foramen ovale, and more posterior and lateral to it there is a small foramen known as the foramen spinosum. Now medially to these both foramen ovale and the foramen spinosum, like medially we can see this foramen over here. This is known as the foramen lacerum, and when a person is alive, like in life, this foramen it's filled with a fibrous tissue, so very less contents pass through it. But when a person dies, and you can see here, as you can see, a dried skull, it's open. So this is an important clinical over here about the foramen lacerum, and it's important for viva point of view, so keep that thing in mind. Now next, as you move along the temporal bone, here you can see this hole is the temporal bone over here, and this one over here, this is known as zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This is zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This articulates with this temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and together these form this zygomatic arch. Okay, so this zygomatic arch is formed over here, and as you walked through this zygomatic arch, below it you can see a prominence over here. This is known as the articular tubercle or the articular eminence, and behind it you can see a deep depression over here. It's known as the mandibular fossa. And what's the mandibular fossa? Mandibular fossa is the place where the mandible attaches with this temporal bone and forms the TMJ or the temporomandibular joint, and this is the only movable joint in this skull. Move more to the midline of this mandibular fossa, you see the teres portion of the temporal bone. Here overall, here this hole is the teres portion of the temporal bone, and in this teres portion of the temporal bone is important canal over here is the carotid canal. Now as you locate the carotid canal over here, like this, I'm locating the carotid canal. This known as the carotid canal, and it's known as the carotid canal because it's a passageway for the carotid artery, and behind the carotid canal there is a foramen known as the jugular foramen. Jugular foramen is an important passageway for many important contents, which I'm going to tell you at the end of the video. Okay, next, more laterally to the jugular foramen, there is a pointy process over here, and on the other side as well. This pointed process of the temporal bone is known as the styloid process of the temporal bone. And more laterally to this styloid process, there is a prominence It's another process of the temporal bone known as the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Now these styloid process and the mastoid process, these both are the attachment sites for muscles. So that's all about the temporal bone. Now finally here we see the occipital bone. That's the most posterior part of the inferior view of the skull. This hole is the occipital bone, and here you can see a large foramen. This foramen is known as the foramen magnum. As you can see, this is huge or magnified or something like that, so it's named accordingly because it's very huge. And on the both sides of this foramen magnum, here you can see these two condyles, and these condyles are named as the occipital condyles. These condyles take part in the articulation with the atlas bone or the first cervical bone, and these form or contribute to the atlanto-occipital joint. Okay, next on this occipital bone, you can see an important protuberance over here, the most posterior side. This protuberance over here is known as the external occipital protuberance, and if you see horizontally over here, there is an important line over here which is known as the superior nuchal line, and above it here is the inferior nuchal lines, and these both lines, these also serve as attachment points for muscles. So this is an attachment point for muscle, this is an attachment point for muscle, and also the styloid process and the mastoid process, these are attachment sites for the muscles. So this was all about this inferior view of the skull. First of all, we discussed about the most anterior part, then we moved on to the more middle part, and then lastly we discussed about the more posterior part of the inferior view of the skull. Now next I'm going to tell you about some important foramens and its contents. Okay, so first of all we discuss about the incisive foramen. As you can see over here, this incisive foramen is an important passageway for the nasopalatal nerves. As I told you before also, this is an important passageway for the nasopalatal nerves. Then we have this foramen ovale over here. This is the foramen ovale, and the foramen ovale, it's the passageway for the mandibular nerves of the trigeminal nerves. So it's the passageway for mandibular nerves of trigeminal nerves. Then third, as you can see here, I've labeled it as the carotid canal. So this over here is the carotid canal over here, and its content is very simple. That's the carotid artery. Then over here, as you can see, this is the jugular foramen. Jugular foramen is a very important foramen because it's a passageway for many many contents pass through it. Namely, first of all, there is the jugular veins pass through it, then there is the glossopharyngeal nerve pass through it, and the vagus nerve pass through it, and lastly the accessory nerve pass through it. And the fifth foramen is here between the styloid process and the mastoid process. In between it, there is this stylomastoid foramen. It's the stylomastoid foramen over here, and facial nerve exits here. Then here you can see this sixth foramen over here that I've labeled as the mastoid foramen. Okay, there is another important foramen, or basically canal. Here you can see this is the foramen magnum, and superiorly and laterally to it here you can see a canal that's known as the hypoglossal canal. Okay, this hypoglossal canal is an important passageway for the hypoglossal nerve. So that was all about this whole lecture. First of all, here we discussed about the anterior part of the inferior view, then we discussed about the middle part, lastly we discussed about the most posterior part, and then we discussed about important canals and important foramens over here, its contents, and I use important color coding over here. So now if you don't get anything in my lecture, so let me know in the comment section below. Till then, subscribe my channel, and Allah Hafiz, and see you in the next lecture.